Hey guys, Richard Holdner here, and welcome to the channel. Please make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell so you can get notified about all of these cool tests. Today we're taking a look at some Dodge sibling rivalry. We've got the 5.9 liter 360 Dodge Magnum versus the slightly smaller 5.7 liter Dodge Hemi. Which one makes more power? I know what you're thinking, Richard. The Hemi makes 100 more horsepower. This isn't even a good comparison. Yeah, but which one makes more torque? In this video, we're going to take a look at a comparison between the slightly larger 5.9 liter Dodge 360 Magnum and the motor that eventually replaced it, the slightly smaller 5.7 liter Dodge Hemi. Now, we know the Hemi was a big step up in performance, but guess what? The Magnum actually makes a little bit more torque, especially down low. Then we're going to take a look at what Dodge did to improve that situation by introducing the Gen 4 Hemi with very cool stuff like more compression, more cylinder head flow, and variable cam timing. Check it out. Since I don't have a Hemi video on the dyno, here's what it would sound like. Wah! After running our Junkyard 360 Magnum for the first time, it allowed me to compare testing that I'd done previously on a number of different Hemi applications to see how far the Hemi was in terms of evolution past the original Magnum motor, and then see what happened when they evolved the Hemi even more. So we take a look at the Dodge Magnum that we ran from the Junkyard, just something we went and picked up. We put long tube headers on it. We ran it with the Holley HP management system the same way that we ran the Hemi. We ran it with long tube headers and, you know, with an optimized tune, stock throttle body, stock, basically everything else was stock other than the headers. Now, we didn't run accessories on it, and we didn't run the air cleaner. We obviously didn't run because we were running the long tube headers. We just had collector extensions. Both motors or in fact, all three motors were run in this same configuration. And what we did was run the Magnum first, and the Magnum was originally rated at 245 horsepower and 345 foot-pounds of torque. Now, the way that we run it on the engine dyno, obviously with long tube headers and open exhaust, no accessories, no air intake, and an optimized tune, we run it a bit colder than the factory does. It always ends up making more power. So the way that we ran this, our Hemi, our 360 Junkyard motor, made right at 300 horsepower. You see the curve here, 300.2, and right at 400 foot-pounds, actually 399.3 foot-pounds. We ran this thing all the way down to 2,600 RPM. It offered very good torque, as you would expect, given that it's a truck application. But the interesting thing is, we wanted to compare this to an 06 or 07, let's say. I think the motor that I ran actually was a 2006 5.7 liter from a Ram 1500, so it was a Hemi. Now, originally, the Hemi was rated at 100 more horsepower than the Magnum. It was rated at 345 horsepower and 375 foot-pounds of torque. The interesting thing is the Magnum, the horsepower rating, it made peak power at 4,000 RPM, and it was supposed to make peak torque at 3,250, and that's kind of where we got these here. The Magnum pushed power production much higher in the RPM range. The peak power was supposed to occur at 5,400, and peak torque was supposed to occur at 4,200. So now the Hemi was basically supposed to make peak torque as high as the Magnum made peak horsepower. But let's take a look. Here's what happened when we ran the 06 Hemi. And you can see it does indeed make a lot more power than the Magnum. So run the way that we run these things with we ran the stock truck manifold and stock throttle body. In fact, we just converted the drive-by-wire throttle body to manual operation. I just welded an arm on it so that we can open it with a throttle opening. We ran headers on this, although I think that this early Magnum, let me see it, we may have just run SRT8 manifolds on this thing. So yes, it was not long tube headers. It was actually SRT8 manifold. So there may be a little bit more power available from the Hemi with long tube headers. The interesting thing is not so much that it made so much more power. We can see it did indeed make peak power at a higher engine speed. It made peak torque at a higher engine speed. It made a little bit more torque. In this case, on the engine dyno, we made 383 horsepower with the Hemi and 419.8. So we'll call that 420 foot-pounds. So it did indeed make a little bit more torque, more peak torque than the Magnum, quite a bit more peak horsepower as we would expect. But the interesting thing, and the thing that I want you to look at in this comparison between the Hemi and the Magnum, we know that it was a big change. I mean, it was based on the rated power outputs, it's a dramatic increase for Dodge enthusiasts. But take a look down here below 3,600 RPM, where the Magnum is at, with the beer keg manifold, is making quite a bit more power, and we'll get into why some of this when we take a look at the next generation of the Hemi. But you can see that down low, where it'd be very important for a lot of towing and truck applications, the things that you're going to use your truck for, the Magnum's actually a little bit better than the Hemi down there. And so the Magnum guys can hold their head high and say, yeah, okay, the Hemi guys make a bajillion horsepower, but the Magnum down low seems to actually work fairly well. And obviously you can modify the Magnum and get the power up too. But it's nice to know that they make this good low-speed power. But let's see how the Hemi engineers stepped up their game on the Hemi to improve not only power down low, where it obviously needed it compared to the Magnum, but basically power everywhere. So let's take a look. So we've taken a look at a comparison between the Magnum 360 and the later 345 horsepower 5.7 liter Hemi, the Gen 3. And before we step up to the latest generation, I'm calling a Gen 4 Hemi, and see how they modified it, let's take a look at the differences and why this Hemi is better. It basically has almost more of everything. I mean, it does have less displacement, so that's might be part of the reason why we see more torque down low on the Dodge Magnum. But it has more compression, 9.6 versus 9.1 is somewhere in those areas on the static compression. It also has a little bit better cam timing. Both of them have hydraulic roller cams, but the Magnum cam is a 411, 413 lift and 182, 194 duration at 50 split. On the Hemi, on the early Hemi, it has more lift, 472 and 460 on the exhaust, and a 192, 196 split. So it has both more lift and more duration than the Magnum, so more camshaft, obviously going to help make power. One of the big things that the Hemi has is much better cylinder heads. Even the early Hemi heads, which flow the least of all of the Hemi families, are still a ton better than a Magnum head. I mean, a typical Magnum head might be flow 200 CFM, and a Hemi head might be 260 or 270 CFM. So it might be 60 or 70 CFM better. That's quite a bit per runner. So, and on the intake side, both of them have long runner EFI intake manifolds. The Hemi has a much bigger throttle opening, and I would guess that the throttle body itself flows much more. But the manifolds themselves also, the Hemi manifold flows more than the beer keg manifold does. And I have not measured them, but I would suspect also that in addition to not flowing as well, that the runners probably on the beer keg manifold might even be longer than the long runners that are in the Hemi. So the Hemi basically has everything like its LS counterpart, except for wilder camshaft. But compared to a Magnum, it even has more camshaft. So it's not surprising that it makes so much more power. But now let's take a look and see what happened, what the Dodge engineers did to, obviously they noticed this deficiency and maybe their people were complaining about it, but here's what they did to combat this and make the Hemi even stronger, not just down low, but everywhere as we see. Here's what happened when this is a late model Hemi. This one was a 2017 or 18, I think. And you can see in red, the late model Hemi is even better, and they did a number of things to make it better than the previous generation Hemi. And we didn't run it all the way down to 2500, but it would be better than the Magnum even down there. And the reason for this is they have, again, more of everything. On the intake manifold side, they have a dual runner intake manifold, so they have both longer and shorter, relatively speaking, intake runners, and having the dual runner allows it to make a lot of low speed power because the long runner helps them do that, and then the shorter runner helps them continue to make power at a higher engine speed, which works out very well. They also have a different camshaft. Now, in reality, the camshaft has a little bit less intake duration, 186 versus 192 compared to the early Hemi cam. It has more exhaust duration, 206 versus 196. It has more lift than the early Hemi cam, 499 versus 472 on the intake and 493 versus 460 on the exhaust. But the trick that the new Hemi has, it has a variable cam. So they can advance and retard the cam to, again, further improve power production over a broader range. And that's exactly what this does. The new Hemi has more static compression. It's up to 10.5 to 1. And it has much better cylinder heads that flow over 300 CFM. So they're as as good as the Hemi heads were compared to the Magnum heads. These new Hemi heads are even better. So they offer basically more of everything, which we saw the original Hemi did over the Magnum, and that the new Hemi does over the original Hemi. So the later Hemi, very good motor. It basically has everything to make it even better. And we would expect that, given, you know, time marches on and technology improves and we see better stuff. But it's interesting to note the early Hemi versus the Magnum and how good that the Magnum did on torque. And so we're now excited about even making even more power with this Magnum with some kicker mods and all kinds of things to see how close maybe we can get it to an original Hemi. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do we learn in this comparison between the original Dodge Magnum motor and the later Gen 3 Hemi, then eventually the Gen 4 Hemi? Well, we learned this. The original Magnum, that was a step up from the LA motors. The cylinder heads were better. It had the beer keg manifold. It had mild cam timing. All of that combined to make the thing pretty super torquey, especially down low. Now, when Dodge introduced the 5.7 Hemi, it had lots of head flow and more cam timing and more compression, a good intake manifold. So naturally, it made a lot more power. I mean, they stepped up a lot. 100 extra horsepower is a big jump in performance, but they did sacrifice power down low. Now, when they introduced the Gen 4 Hemi with lots of cool stuff, more compression, even more head flow, variable cam timing, and a very cool dual runner intake, they obviously more than made up for that difference. And now the new Hemi, as we would expect, is even better. But if you want the ultimate in power and torque, you could always step up to the 6.4 liter. I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More testing coming up.